Meanwhile, here in the United States, JD Vance, media critic, or I should say JD Vance put his media critic hat on yesterday in Sparta at an event in Sparta, Michigan, where the fallout from the cats and dog meme cycle continues on the campaign trail. Let's go ahead and roll this clip of Vance criticizing media coverage of bomb threats that have come into various places in Springfield, Ohio, since this really took off just in the last couple of weeks. Here's what JD Vance had to say.
A lot of people who pretend to be fair journalists, you know what they've been saying? For the last few days, Springfield has been experiencing an unbelievable number, something like 35, 40 bomb threats in Springfield in just the last few days. And you know what the governor of Ohio came out yesterday and said? Every single one of those bomb threats was a hoax, and all of those bomb threats came from foreign countries. So the American media, for 3 days, has been lying and saying that Donald Trump and I are inciting bomb threats, when in reality, the American media has been laundering foreign disinformation. It is disgusting, and every single one of them owes the residents of Springfield an apology.
All right, well, David Frum weighed in on this, and JD Vance then responded to David Frum. JD Vance has been very online as of late, to say the least, at least for a non-Trump presidential candidate, that is to say, someone who is not Donald Trump himself. David Frum said, the upsetting things said by Trump and Vance are not true. The upsetting things said about Trump and Vance are true. Trump really did mount a violent coup against the Constitution. He and his relatives really did take bribes in office, including from foreign governments, et cetera, et cetera. And Vance really did, and by his own admission, intentionally, quote, create stories for political advantage that put residents of his state at risk of physical harm. JD responded, I'd say the most important difference is that people on your team tried to kill Donald Trump twice. Ryan, what do you make of that back and forth, and not just JD versus David Frum, but also JD versus the media writ large?
What about either of those shooters, I'd say, makes them part of, quote unquote, David Frum's team. Also, who's David Frum's team?
Ukraine. So there might be something to that one in the very, very zoomed out vantage point that this suspect has been, obviously, as Sagar and Crystal have been covering.
The Ukraine nut.
Ukraine nut,
yeah.
Right. And a sort of the most intense version of a hawk that you could find on Ukraine, on China. I guess roughly aligned with David Frum, probably on those two policies in the abstract.
So maybe Frum needs to eat that one. The other guy,
I don't know.
Not so sure about the other guy.
Yeah, we still have no idea, which is strange in and of itself.
But it does seem kind of funny that JD Vance wants, precision and accuracy in the reporting on the bomb threats, and wants context as well. When his original story that he was telling, which led to these bomb threats, led to them, whether or not they were pranksters from the little Russian troll army or whatever he's suggesting it is. Okay, that's funny, by the way.
The bomb threats,
yeah,
right.
Can we acknowledge that that's funny, that he's saying it's like foreign interference?
Yes.
In the election?
Yes.
Okay, that's funny.
Yes,
right?
that is funny.
They were triggered by the stories that he was telling. He has said, look, I created this story. Now, what he'll say is, what I mean by created is I repeated some stories that I had heard from constituents.
Right. He was, and in context, that was one of the annoying things about the David Frum tweet, is that he did, that legitimately, if you watch that entire interview in context, he said that so poorly. I mean, just from a political standpoint, his comms staffers were probably groaning when they heard that. But in the larger context, he was saying, this is not a fabrication because my constituents have been coming to me for months, blah, blah, blah. So even if whether or not that's true, it's not actually what he was saying.
Right, but the claims don't seem to be standing up. They have found no missing cats and dogs. The original source of that claim has apologized for circulating a bomb rumor, and she should. It's sad that she has to apologize nationally for.
She posted something on Facebook.
She posted something on Facebook that she heard from her daughter, who heard it from a cousin, who heard it from a friend. Not a good source. Not the kind of thing you would base a national story around. The whole 20,000 number is also looks rather flimsy.
It's in the New York Times. That's
Yeah. New
no,
York
but that's what I'm
Times.
saying. That's why I think it's taken off.
It's in the New York Times.
Well, right,
Yeah.
but the Times reported it, which is where a lot of people source the number to.
Yeah, and I think the town manager or the mayor had said it like a year ago or something like that. They had. My rule of thumb is be very skeptical of nice round numbers, whether it comes to no contest bidding, like $50 million from McKinsey, as Matt Stoller reported.
Yeah.
Remember, it's $50 million. Okay, what are you gonna do with that? Don't worry about it. It's just $50 million. We'll do something with it. Whenever somebody says, "Oh, there were 20,000," the number's 20,000. It's like, I'm not so sure that's actually based on anything other than let's put a number out there that is large enough to convey the concern that we have for the growth in the population. Turned out, they're not here illegally. That's complicated.
Well, and interesting, actually.
Yeah. And so JD Vance, on the one hand, wants his bigger truth to withstand the fact that a lot of what's underneath it isn't actually true. But when it comes to the bomb threats, he wants all of the motivations checked before people report that there was a bomb threat. If you're walking out of your school because the Russians called one in, or because it was like a MAGA dude, you're walking out of the school either way.
I will say a lot of the media coverage, though, did implicitly or explicitly blame the bomb threats on JD Vance, and that's an argument that can absolutely be made. JD Vance and Donald Trump
Russia
were the ones that
whoever wouldn't be doing it without.
Right, but here's where I think it gets especially interesting, and I'm just thinking about this from the perspective, obviously, of a conservative. It's like Springfield, Ohio, the New York Times did a follow-up here. Estimates range between 12,000 and 20,000. To your point, 12,000 is a significantly different number than 20,000, although still a very significant number for the size of Springfield.
There's a serious population there of Haitians.
Right, yeah. According to city officials who have spoken with the Times, and those estimates are based on data from the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, Springfield's public schools, healthcare providers, and social service agencies. So in the big picture, there's obviously a story here of strain and on a social and economic level from this influx of migrants. And that's a story that can be glass half empty or glass half full, depending on how you look at it. You could say these strains are what we've always done in America as we accommodate new populations who come in and do great jobs in the factories and build their way into middle-class lives. Or you could say these are taxpayers who are having trouble with overcrowding in schools and housing costs going up, and they have all of these perfectly well-intentioned objections to what's happened over the course of the Biden-Harris administration. So you can see that from different perspectives no matter what. But one thing is true, and that's basically that the press didn't talk about this story until JD Vance and Donald Trump started talking about it in the outrageous context. And one thing to the story that I would say is not in defense of politicians lying, of course not. But on the other hand, the sort of legacy press does not do itself any favors by ignoring some of these bigger plot lines for ideological reasons, because that's what things boil over in the absence of attention on what is legitimately a newsworthy story. And then we end up, it makes the Donald Trumps and JD Vances of the world more and more likely to talk in massively exaggerated terms. That's not a defense of them talking in massively exaggerated terms whatsoever. It is, though, just to say there's some responsibility on the part of the media to dedicate proportional coverage here and to cover immigration much better than it does. It's just sort of, for me, like crying over spilt milk when they start to whine about JD Vance and Donald Trump. It's like, well, you're creating an atmosphere that makes this more and more likely, and it's an unforced error because your job is to cover this stuff fairly.
But while it's true that they haven't covered Springfield, Ohio, because it's a town of roughly 50,000 people or whatever, as a national story, I think they have covered immigration in a pretty hawkish way.
I don't think they've done a very good job of covering.
The border, Democrats talk about how the border is a complete disaster. Republicans talk about how the border is a complete disaster. The mainstream news media covers the border as a complete disaster. And related to that is the suggestion that there's like hordes of people coming up. Like, I think from like an immigration hawk's perspective, the media is serving up all the hysteria that you could want. Like, okay, now they're talking about Springfield in particular, but have they really been ignoring the question of the border?
Well, the question of, I think, integration of this, like that's what I think has been, I don't think the corporate press has been entirely ignoring the question of the border, but the question of what happens once people get over the border and then seek to integrate in sometimes mid-sized, mid-range communities, Springfield, Dayton area. That story is, I think, very rarely covered. And it's an interesting story actually from the left and the right.
This one, the claim was that they're not integrating into the community.
Right.
And the evidence for that was that they're stealing and eating like dogs and cats.
Well, no, I mean, there were people talking at all those town council meetings about housing costs going up, about the problems with schools, about that was people being forced out of housing situations. I mean, there weren't just people repeating the dogs and cats stuff at those meetings. It was everything else too. And that's why I think it's unfortunate, because even from the perspective of the left, there's a lot that could be said about what are these factory workers being taken advantage of? Are they union? Are they what are these conditions fair and acceptable for people who
right?
come in?
And what would the city look like without them?
Right. No, seriously, I think that's super interesting. And it doesn't have to be right wing, but I think a lot of journalists are just stuck in this rut where criticizing. And there are certain countries in Europe that have gotten out of that reflex, but where criticizing mass immigration, which has clearly objectively happened, and I didn't say mass illegal immigration. I think that's important because a lot of the Haitian migrants, you look at their papers and they're perfectly legal. They're making asylum claims and waiting for them to be adjudicated in the asylum courts, and they have work permits and all of that, and it's a perfectly legal form of immigration because they're making asylum claims en masse. So it's not just like illegal immigration, it's going through legal pathways that we've expanded. So there's just super legitimate and interesting questions that don't have to result in necessarily like conservative arguments, but the media is just in this reflexive rut of being disinterested in anything that might be highly critical of mass migration. The New York Times did do an excellent series on children who were being exploited, that had been trafficked over the border and were missing. DHS just missing thousands of migrant children. That was a great series, but there's so many different stories like that and different sort of downstream effects that I just rarely see covered.
And just to check out, so I just Googled the number of journalists in Ohio, and the first thing that comes up is from 2012 to 2019, Ohio lost 43% of its newspaper journalists.
I agree with that.
From 2019 until today, you can imagine that the number collapsed, much further. I imagine if you looked at whatever the newspaper situation is in Springfield, the news situation is in Springfield 10, 15 years ago, and what it is more broadly from the Ohio papers, the Dayton paper, and also like the Toledo Blade and the others who cover the state more broadly, you'll see probably a 90% collapse in journalistic capacity.
Totally.
And when that happens, you only have time to cover the weather, traffic, new businesses that are opening.
Local sports.
And
a lot of times.
But like actual reporting on anything that takes effort.
Yeah.
That what they call that enterprise at those newspapers, enterprise reporting. And it takes enterprise to go and do it. That is the thing that gets cut.
Right, and it often ends up coming from a bureau in a city dozens of miles away at least, if not.
And those bureaus are shut.
Right, so
those are the first ones that get shut down.
You have, the Cleveland reporters or the Columbus reporters reporting on Springfield, Dayton, as opposed to having a robust local paper in Dayton. This was one of the big things, I think, during the sort of school culture wars during COVID. I think I did a monologue on this. If we had more robust local news, that used to be the pipeline where a lot of the stuff got worked out before it ended up in the national media, because some of these conversations would be hashed out by the free press. Like the free press would facilitate sharing relevant information to the community, and the community would come together and sort of figure out a solution, I think a lot of these school board confrontations would have stayed local instead of being blown up into divisive national news cycles. I could not agree with that more. So it's just...
And yeah, it looks like Springfield was a victim of corporate consolidation from Cox Enterprises, which is this, you know Cox, it's like this gigantic behemoth that gobbles up local news and then basically gets rid of all the local in it, centralizes it at the top, combines it with radio and other local newspapers, and basically just gives the same news with a slight tweak, maybe one person in Springfield. So that's the Springfield Sun, it looks like. And in late 2010, Cox Enterprises merged all of its local media holdings under the CMG Ohio brand and consolidated locations. In addition, its print publications holdings include a bunch of different like radio and local TV. So they're just consolidating it all and getting rid of all the workers.
Lovely.
And then, yeah, you're not going to get, you get what you pay for, or you get what you allow the oligarchs to control.
Right.
As this democratic society.
So let's watch this Hillary Clinton clip, which is a little bit of a pivot, but gets into the broader conversation about disinformation. So this was Hillary Clinton on Rachel Maddow talking about what consequences should come to people who are allegedly disseminating Russian propaganda.
I think it's important to indict the Russians, just as Mueller indicted a lot of Russians who were engaged in direct election interference and boosting Trump back in 2016. But I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda. And whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence, because the Russians are unlikely, except in a very few cases, to ever stand trial in the United States. You know, they're not going to be going to a country where they can be extradited or even returning to the United States unless they are very foolish. So I think we need to uncover all of the connections and make it very clear that you could vote however you want. But we are not going to let adversaries, whether it is Russia, China, Iran, or anybody else, basically try to influence Americans as to how we should vote in picking our leaders.
You can vote however you want. You just can't say whatever you want.
It's a nice concession.
Yeah,
we appreciate that.
Yeah, she's willing to compromise, willing to come to the table. You can vote however you want for now.
You know that in her heart of hearts, she thinks it should be a crime to have voted for Donald Trump.
To vote for Donald Trump, right? Because you're
absolutely a crime.
A Russian puppet, and we can't stand for that.
And for her to go on television and float that some Americans should perhaps be charged criminally for repeating what she calls Russian talking points is amazing. It's utterly amazing.
Where is old leftist Rachel Maddow to jump in and say, excuse me, ma'am, former Secretary of State? What exactly are we talking about here?
I guess we don't look to former Secretaries of State to uphold principles of democracy anywhere around the world, so we might as well not look for it here at home. But good Lord.
Glenn had a great point. He said Glenn Greenwald posted, if Hillary's insanely repressive measure were implemented, people spreading disinformation could be imprisoned. The first two people to share a prison cell should be her and Maddow, who drowned the country in Steele dossier, Alpha Bank service, and other demented debunked lies, which, by the way, could easily have been Russian disinformation that was funneled intentionally to Christopher Steele, as Steele would be this sort of useful idiot. He's out with a new book. Maybe we can get him on.
All we can do is let a jury sort it out.
That's right. That's right. Disinformation, very real. Punishment for disinformation, also increasingly very real. And these two things are not necessarily, or should not necessarily be related.
Well. Amazing.
You have to have some tolerance for disinformation in a free society, of course, but I guess we're losing that muscle memory. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.